Hey, so yesterday my friend and colleague Natasha Nell sent me a link to a 40-minute video of someone whose opinion of J.K. Rowling sparked her interest. The video was titled The Thought Crimes of J.K. Rowling. We ended up talking for 2 hours and even decided to maybe do a podcast on it. For context, I've been extremely vocal about my distress and disillusionment at J.K. Rowling, my used to be childhood hero, on her bigotry towards trans people. I pretty much spent the entire month prior to that just in agony and even denial because I just could not bring myself to reconcile my love, my pure childhood love for Harry Potter, and just my plain disgust at the harm that J.K. Rowling has created for trans people. So in this video, I decided to react to that video and bring some commentary as I watch along in this video format. This is the first time I'm doing something like this. I figure if Natasha found that helpful, then maybe someone else as well. I might as well use my position as a woman, a feminist, a person of color, as well as a used to be Potterhead to add my voice to the matter. Now, stepping back a little bit, the reason why I have been so vocal about this matter, I mean, I'm not a trans person, and I mean, up until very recently, as have many people, I have not even been made to be aware of the struggle that trans people have faced just simply for like existing in this society. I thought long and hard about this question, and I think the answer has got to be Black Lives Matter. I know it sounds far-fetched, but hear me out. So the J.K. Rowling controversy, if you don't know already, happened in the middle, I mean, of Pride Month, right? It was right after the historic decision of Supreme Court Justice of America to include trans people as well as lesbian and gay and LGBTQ community in the protected category. So they will be protected from discrimination against any other, just like any other groups. It's also obviously in the middle of a pandemic that has disproportionately killed Black people and brown people in general. And of course, in the middle of the protests, again, racial injustice and police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's death, but as well as many others under the hand of police. Now, it is exactly under this backdrop of historic, important moments in our collective lived memory that J.K. Rowling decided to tweet her pretty snarky remark about an article's word choice, more inclusive word choice of menstruators to refer to biological women. I mean, which begs the question, why? Like, why that month? Why this exact moment? Just out of the 14 million people who follow you, you think that is the most important thing that you should tweet about in that moment? So anyway, amidst all of this happenings in the country, a lot of people like myself have brought to social media, right? We all stuck at home and we just got made to think more critically and more deeply about the issues that actually matter and start pretty much doing activism on social media. A quote that was widely circulated around the time was, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. you have got to be anti-racist by Angela Davis. And I think that quote just resonated with so many people, bringing them to the street, bringing them online to express their part in the movement against racism. When the J.K. Rowling thing happened, the exact quote got circled in my head, but the version of it being, in a transphobic society, it is not enough to be non-transphobic. You have got to be anti-transphobic. So I think it just makes sense that now is the time that I use my position, as I mentioned, as someone who actually has vested interest in this, because I care a great deal about powerful, influential women like J.K. Rowling who claim to be feminist. I myself, as a feminist, hell, even my feminism was very, very early on rooted in powerful women like J.K. Rowling, who, in my opinion, writes women who are real characters, who are bold and nuanced and sometimes even bad. I love that. And learning about her fight and her championing the cause for, women and children, that's just very fundamental in my early days, when I was a teenager, decision to be a feminist. And I think the very fact that my friend Natasha, who is my age, who's also a feminist, who considers herself to be progressive, just like myself, finds arguments like that of the video, which I'm going to react to, for whatever reason, convincing, says a lot about what I can only describe as the eloquence of bigotry, right? Bigotry can be extremely well-spoken. That's why they can prevail. They dress themselves as something good, right? Homophobia is dressed as this this appreciation of the purity of marriage and of having children. Racism dressed as this appreciation for Western civilization, and the return to, democratic values. And of course, the newest reincarnated version of bigotry is transphobia dressed as feminism, right? Now, the main word for it is actually TERF, trans, exclusionary, radical feminist. So I think looking and listening to a TERF argument would be very helpful for myself, Natasha, and people like ourselves. So without further ado, let me start on the reaction video, and I hope you find this helpful. I'm starting at about around 6 minutes because the first 6 is just personal promotion.
When she wrote those famous books, so good for her. But I was really intrigued when Rowling's name came up in the public conversation a few months ago for having dared to offer her public support on social media to Maya Forstater. Now, Forstater was the tax specialist in the UK who was fired from her position at the Centre for Global Development. This is a charity. She was fired for stating in a tweet that, quote, "Men cannot change into women." Forstater decided to challenge the decision in court to fire her from her job, but her case was, shockingly to me, dismissed. In the 26-page judgment, Judge James Taylor claimed that Forstater's views, quote, "did not have the protected characteristic of philosophical belief," and suggested that Forstater's claim that men cannot change into women did indeed constitute a violation of the dignity of others, and that such an assertion created, quote, "a hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment not worthy of respect in a democratic society," end quote.
Okay, stop there. She and J.K. Rowling both use this tactic of cherry picking the and singling out the one thing from the 26 pages that the judge had. I would highly encourage you to actually read what the judgment is. Now, this Maya person, she did not just get fired, plain and simple like that, because of a tweet. She wanted to fight that against the court. There are 5 main characteristics of protected speech. Protected speech, such as, I am a woman, he's a man, I'm gay, he's not gay, that's kind of thing. Protected speech, and the judge ruled that sure, she can have that opinion, no problem, but a democratic society does not have to think of that opinion as a good opinion. So it's your call, but look into the judgment itself.
Ooh. More recently, Rowling shared a tweet in response to an article about people who menstruate, also known as menstruators or bleeders. And Rowling wrote, quote, "People who menstruate. I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Women, wimpund, woomud." And then later, Rowling wrote,
okay. Again, go to the source. This case has been well documented on J.K. Rowling's own Twitter, but the article that she cited actually did mean only people who menstruate. That does not mean, underage girls or people after menopause. They actually do want to pragmatically call menstruators and not any other kind of women. So this is just a scapegoat way of calling out non-exclusive, inclusive language for trans people, as we're gonna find out later.
quote, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives."
This is something that this person, J.K. Rowling, and all the Terps do not want to admit and just conveniently ignore. No one, literally no one, said that sex is not real. Maybe a tiny bit of people, the extremely far people in this discourse. Most people, and yes, trans people, acknowledge and know that sex is real. Because sex is real, that's why they transition in the first place. They also just want people who think that sex is real or who mention that sex is real to also consider that gender is real, just as valid.
Isn't hate to speak the truth? Now, I've never actually explicitly, publicly spoken about my own perspective on this topic, and I'm going to explain why, in what, for some of you, will probably register as a convoluted fashion. But anyway, bear with me, or not, because I want to do justice to the complexity of this issue. So I've been following this conversation and engaged in this conversation privately for about 8 years, long before the subject of gender identity had become a mainstream preoccupation as it is now, or was prior to Rona, but it still is now. So even in elementary school, as a very young child, I was a passionate advocate for social justice and human rights. As I've said before, I've always considered myself to be a radical and a leftist. I've described myself as a socialist libertarian or an anarcho-syndicalist when pressed to define my views. And I'm not sure I would say the same now. I feel in some ways politically homeless at this point. I also now wonder if maybe I'm a classical liberal, actually, but I have and will always be committed to justice, peace, and equity, and committed to having all of the difficult conversations, maybe at my own expense. I was also, myself, a highly gender non-conforming kid. I cut off all my hair in grade 5 and was teased mercilessly, but I was always fairly resilient also to bullying. And compared with how a lot of other kids were treated, I felt pretty lucky. I loathed school. I rarely attended any of my high school classes, and instead I hung out at the bookstores and cafes along Broadway in Kitsilano, Vancouver, where I grew up, and I read everything that I could get my hands on. And I maintained fairly good grades, mostly because I was just adept at playing the game. In grade 9, I went through a Leonard Cohen phase, and I remember one of the cool girls spotting my battered copy of The Favorite Game on my desk. I recognize in retrospect that this is an appallingly misogynistic novel, but I loved it at the time. And I had an original Penguin copy of that book, and the cover depicted a girl in kind of 60s style, posing quite suggestively on the cover. And this cool girl teased me very publicly, telling everyone in the class that I was clearly a lesbian on account of my interest in such a book. Now, ironically, that girl ended up becoming a proudly out lesbian herself, so I came to understand that this was probably a clear case of projection, and I also can't help wondering if maybe she had a crush as well. But obviously I've never forgotten that. It's really stuck in my mind. And I wasn't a lesbian, to my great disappointment. Bisexual, maybe, but that question is pretty moot at this point. I'm married to a man, happily so. But I was deeply uncomfortable with the sexualization of women, which then, in the 90s, was, I think, actually much less overt than it is now. In any case, I experienced quite severe gender dysphoria as a result of the emergence of my sexed body.
Wait a minute. I'm a little confused. She said she experiencing gender dysphoria. Like, does she really mean that at that point in her life she felt like a boy but was presented as a girl? I mean, her storytelling up until that point does not suggest that at all. So, I mean, what she describes sounds to me like the very common experience that many women have of resenting their own female body at some point in their lives, which pretty much is misogyny projection on themselves, right? But it is not gender dysphoria, I don't think.
And I expressed that dysphoria as anorexia, primarily. And what I've discovered or observed since then and throughout my own recovery is that this connection between nourishment and sexuality and sexualization and objectification is layered and profound and very pernicious, and I think also present in some degree for all women.
Yeah.
This kind of socialization that all women are exposed to is intimately connected to the tyranny of gender, which, as I see it, is a hierarchical system that dictates that girls and women must, should conform and perform to a certain set of stereotypes associated with our sex. And the same is true on the flip side for boys and men in relation to masculinity. Gender is the expectation that women are nice and sweet and soft and accommodating, and we just naturally love to wear pink ruffles and party dresses. Gender is the stereotype and expectation that boys, on the other hand, love trucks and cars, and that they're confident and strong, and they wear suits in adulthood or shirts with dinosaurs and trucks on them as little kids, etc. So gender is the idea that these behaviors and that even these preferences are innate. Sex, on the other hand, refers simply to biological reality. Humans are a sexually dimorphic species. Sex in all mammals is binary.
Okay, so that's not exactly true. Even so, I and most transgender people as well agree that yes, with a few exceptions such as intersex people and people who are born without any sexual organs, yes, that sex for the most part is binary. It's science. It's XX and XY chromosomes. There's nothing to dispute there. Sex is real.
That's not a judgment. It's a fact. Sex is simply the observation of a category of procreative ability. Essentialism is the idea that gendered behaviors and preferences are instinctive or natural. And I disagree with this. I want to live in a world where girls are free to be confident and intellectual and to wear whatever they want, and where boys are likewise taught that compassion and kindness are virtues for everyone, without this being interpreted as unmanly or effeminate. That said, there are certain experiences on account of biological reality that are only available to female people. And these include, hopefully obviously,
Actually, let's continue.
menstruation, pregnancy, and birth.
All right. So while it is true that there are certain characteristics that only biological females can or can't have, it is not true for all women. Okay, this is why intersectionality matters. Now, the lived experience of, as she says, the biological woman, but she just conflates that with all women, right? But what she really means is a biological woman. The lived experience of such a woman is obviously different from that of a trans woman, just like the lived experience of me. A non-white person is also very different from the lived experience of a white person or a white woman, okay? But everyone should be protected under this umbrella of all women, which is what I'm gonna see if she says.
It's not discriminatory to acknowledge these biological differences, nor do these biological differences need to orchestrate the flow of our lives. Many women choose not to become mothers, and this is totally legitimate. But every single woman, female person that is, on this planet will contend with the possibility of pregnancy in her lifetime.
That's not exactly true either. All women, and this includes trans women, will contend with the possibility of having a kid. Not all women will contend with the possibility of being pregnant. Now, this includes trans women, but also infertile women, for example.
Even women who are infertile, even women who choose not to become pregnant, even those extremely rare women who are born without a uterus, they too will contend with the possibility of pregnancy. And for some, that's on account of discovering their developmental differences, right? Or developmental anomalies. Now, I have come to the perspective at this point in my life that there is considerable worth and value for me personally in living as I see it in accordance with the biological rhythms of my body and nature and the power of my womb. I love being a woman. And while I used to dismiss the idea of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine as new age ways to rationalize essentialism, I actually don't feel that way anymore at all. Increasingly, I feel really connected to my femininity on the level of spirit. But this does not negate the value and importance of the radical feminist objective of abolishing gender if one recognizes gender not as deeply held sacred spiritual embodiment, but rather as damaging stereotype, which I do. I think that is an important distinction. One of the central tenets of second wave feminism was the idea that women do not have to conform to any of these stereotypes. That women can be strong and opinionated and intellectual and muscular, and that we can cut all our hair off and put on pants, and that to do so does not make us men, and that doing so does not take away from our womanhood, and that actually femininity can exist on a different level from all of those surface stereotypes. My own gender dysphoria, as I said, emerged when I was a young teenager.
Again, throwing the word gender dysphoria so casually, it's really insulting for people who actually experience gender dysphoria, which is the feeling that you were born, you are trapped in the wrong body, the opposite gender body, which is not what she is describing here. What she's describing here is very real and very true, something that I myself and many other women also experience, is resenting your own body or your own womanhood in some way at some point in our lives. It's not gender dysphoria.
Actually, even younger, I was just a child. And I'm able to recognize now that this dysphoria came up for me because I could see very clearly that the culture in which we live expects, fundamentally, that girls exist for the sexual, visual, and even intellectual gratification and amusement of men, in a nutshell. I saw as a young girl the enormous inequalities between the sexes, and I worried that what was ahead of me was a hideous future as the object of sexual interest for men, and this terrified and disgusted me, and I wanted no part of it. What I did want instead was to be taken seriously. I wanted integrity, I wanted to be respected, and most significantly, I wanted to be safe. Men were and are objectively quite frightening to me in many ways. Statistically, men are the most significant danger to women.
I agree with that. And you know what? So do trans women. Statistically, men are the greatest danger to women, but even more significantly, statistically, they are a danger to trans women. The average age of a black trans woman is 35 years old.
Women live our lives looking over our shoulders in parking lots and walking with our keys between our fingers, and many of us simply assume that this is just normal. This is life. But I don't think it's normal to be so effectively disciplined by male violence to the point that fear is seen as unremarkable. And of course, in many countries, the restrictions and potential violence that women face is so much worse than what I just described. I mean, the normal sort of everyday fear that has become so normalized in Western culture is nothing compared with what so many women experience in other places. Now, I came across a social media post from the Dalai Lama a couple of weeks ago, and that venerated spiritual leader had written that, quote, "Fundamentally, human beings are the same. Imagine being lost in some remote place and suddenly seeing someone coming towards you over the horizon. You wouldn't care about their race, nationality, or religious faith. You'd be filled with the joy of encountering another human being." End quote. Wow. Well, actually, when I imagine being lost in some remote place and suddenly seeing someone coming towards me over the horizon, it's absolutely true that I wouldn't care about their race, their nationality, their religious faith at all. The only thing that would matter in such a scenario, to me, would be their sex. And if it were a man coming over the...
Okay, so let's just ignore the part where she as a white woman just casually, culturally appropriate a quote from Surprise, Surprise, the Dalai Lama. Let's just ignore that and focus on what she just said. Now, I understand that as a cis white person, then the only thing that matters when she faces another person is their sex, because really, a cis white woman, the only dangerous part of their identity is their womanhood. It's not true for all women, certainly not true for me as a non-white person. I would also, for example, consider their race as well. Totally natural for me.
Over the horizon. I would be looking around for the closest object that I could use as a weapon, if necessary, or looking for ways to hide And I know that there are a lot of women out there who would have exactly the same response. Just makes sense, right? But of course, the world is a very different place for men. And we also have to recognize that, of course, the Dalai Lama, one of the most widely recognized and revered spiritual leaders of our age, also expressed not too long ago that if a woman were to ever be incarnated into the role that he presently occupies, she would have to be, quote, very attractive, or she would not be of much use. It's very, very interesting. In any case, the gender dysphoria I felt as a young teenager, as a young girl, as a result of the sexualization of women that I perceived so potently, manifested for me as anorexia, because through starvation, I felt that I could potentially stave off the sexual development of my body, over which otherwise I had no control. To be a woman is to have no control over our bodies in a way that's very different from what men experience. Women's bodies bleed and wiggle and jiggle and are stared at and commented on, whether we like it or not. Being female is visible.
Okay, that's a good one. Yes, being a woman, a lot of it is to experience little to no control of your body. Menstruation is part of it. It's unique for biological cis women. But the experience of being stared at, of being objectified, is pretty much common to all women. Okay, being women is to be stared at, including trans women.
There's nowhere to hide from our bodies. Breasts are prominent signs of femaleness and the inherent vulnerabilities of our sex. Women, on average, are fleshier than men. We are slower than men. We are weaker than men. And this is according to biology. I had no language for any of this as a young woman, though, and the only way I felt that I could enact any resistance was to refuse womanhood and to control my body and to starve the flesh off of my body and to cut my hair off and to be what I hoped was unattractive to men. That didn't work, and eventually, in a perverse response to that failure, and in conjunction with, I realize now, a really deeply held biological urge to become a mother, and also partly because I was just severely messed up and lonely and terrified of life, I ended up getting together with a man several years older than me and having my first 2 babies with him. And this was a tragic and deranged time in my life in so many ways, but it also introduced me to the transformative power of birth and to the realization of how much I deeply adore my female body. Now, I ended up separating from my first husband a few years later, and thankfully soon after that, I met my real husband, Lee, with whom I have 6 babies.
Okay.
And yeah, it's a long, convoluted story, like I said. Now, when Horace, our first child, was just 2 years old, Lee and Horace and I took a trip to Toronto. We stayed with friends, a gay couple, and they told me about a friend of theirs who was trans. And at that time, a decade ago, I hadn't heard the term trans before. But they described to me that this friend of theirs was a male-bodied person or a former male person who now lived as a woman and who felt that the modifications they had made to their physical appearance, namely in the form of the kind of clothing that they chose to wear, actually meant that they were now indeed female. And I remember responding to this with confusion and saying to my friends that of course this individual should wear whatever he wants freely, but that surely wearing dresses is not what makes women female, and that for a man to put on a dress certainly doesn't then make him female, or them, or they.
Okay. My respect for this person just plummeted.
poor that trans woman, she literally just misgendered the person and described her as a man in dress, or refused to even mention her by her true pronouns and say they or them. This is exactly what the transphobes do. They just refuse outright to consider trans people by their true pronouns and refuse to call them by their true pronouns. It's not cool.
I also noted that our child Horace had just recently emerged from my vagina. And so this idea of a man simply stating that he was now a woman and having the people around him validate such a notion seemed truly baffling to me.
Literally, not too long ago, she mentioned that a woman doesn't have to be defined by her willingness or lack thereof, to being a mother. And now she just say, I just literally gave this birth to this child, and you didn't give birth to a child because you couldn't. So how could you? How could you be a woman? You did not just have a child emerge from your vagina. This is what she said.
But I remember our friends demurring and saying, somewhat awkwardly, that their friends certainly believed that that was the case, and we all kind of brushed the conversation off and carried on with our day. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I became involved in several online radical feminist communities, and I started to hear about gender identity as a movement more and more. And because I was also involved in many childbirth groups, as well as many mainstream feminist groups, I really saw both sides of the gender identity movement as it began to gain traction. And for about 5 minutes, I tried so very hard to be a good leftist, because so many of the arguments in favor of gender identitarian politics came from the left, and that was my home. And they were comparing this issue to the fight for gay rights and suggesting that if a person wasn't in full support of the ideology of gender identity, they would be on the wrong side of history in a way that would be similar to the denial of gay rights. Now, that didn't actually seem rational to me, because homosexuality is literally same-sex attraction, and the gender identity movement seemed to be denying the reality of sex altogether.
That is so misguided. Yes, the gender identity movement calls for the recognition that gender identity is very real and very valid. It does not devalue sex at all. In fact, I know many people who, after transitioning, being attracted to the same sex, which would have been the opposite sex prior to the transition, which would have been way easier for them to just stay that way, right? Imagine a trans woman prior to transitioning being attracted to a man, but really feeling like she's actually a woman and transition. And now, after transitioning, realizing or expressing to the world that she's actually, in fact, gay. Why would such a person want to go through A, transphobia, and B, homophobia just to be what? Escaping and denying sex? No. Acknowledging sex is real is good, but gender is also real, and those two do not cancel each other out.
Together. But in any case, like I said, I tried for a day, I think. Very short period of time. But the more I thought about the logical conclusions of accepting this notion that people can change sex through the aesthetics, the more I realized that I really couldn't participate in what seemed so...
Nope. Trans people don't just want to change their aesthetics. That's definitely a certain group of people who only care about the aesthetics. But the majority of trans people actually go through the long, painful process of taking hormones and having facial surgery and bottom surgery and top surgery and all kinds of surgery to be in the body that they feel they truly should have.
Clearly to be a farce, because it's not possible for anyone to change sex. Our sex is encoded into each and every cell in our bodies. And when archaeologists dig a skeleton from the earth from thousands of years ago, that skeletal structure is immediately recognizable as being either male or female. Sex is hardwired into our DNA. How is it that anyone could claim with a straight face that woman has no biological foundation? And if being a woman simply means wearing dresses and lipstick and high heels,
Again, for a million times, no. Being a woman does not mean just simply wearing dresses and lipsticks and high heels. It is much, much deeper than that. It is what you feel truly in your mind and heart that you are a woman. I feel truly in my mind and heart I am a woman, way before I became one, way before menstruation and anything like that. Like being lucky enough to be born with your gender and your sex identity just being perfectly aligned is a privilege. Not all people feel this way, and not all people are so lucky.
even if one is still in possession of a penis, then what does that make me? Was I not a woman when I was wearing jeans and t-shirts? What does that make my butch lesbian friends? Men?
Nope. Your lesbian friends are women who are attracted to other women. Simple as that.
In fact, I was starting to see more and more lesbians, or formerly proud lesbians, choosing to transition and now identifying as men. And this made me terribly, terribly sad, especially when I came across the testimonies of female people who were choosing to identify as trans men, who told similar stories of finally being able to move through the world without fear of men, and without harassment, and without being propositioned for sex. And while I support women in doing whatever they feel they need to do in order to feel safe, I also started to see the gender identity movement as one that pathologized and demonized womanhood. And that instead of supporting women in changing a diseased culture, this movement had us convinced instead that the problem is actually our bodies and our femaleness itself.
No, this is not true. The gender identity movement does not pathologize or demonize womanhood. You cannot explain trans men and trans women and lesbian in the same attack and still say consistent. Now let's go back to my example earlier. There are plenty of women who are born men who choose to transition to be a woman, but also are still attracted to women. So no, why would these people become a woman where the womanhood identity is demonized and pathologized so much? See, this is a weakness of the Terf arguments. You just cannot fit trans men, trans women, and people who are attracted to the same sex in the same category. The argument immediately crumbles. And another thing, no, the problem is absolutely not the female bodies. The problem is a simplistic and puristic definition of what a female is.
I also started to see the money more and more, and the kind of wealth that was being increasingly generated from the dysphoria industry, the gender doctors, the drugs, the surgeries. really, really big business.
All right. So talking about capitalism is a completely separate topic that I don't want to touch on right now, but good for her to describing life-saving drugs and life-saving doctors as evil capitalist, right? Big pharma. I mean, she literally spent about 4 minutes in the beginning of the video, which is why I have to skip that part to minute 6, to literally advertise for her business. So yes, while I agree that there certainly is money, that there's money everywhere, and this does not make life-saving doctors and life-saving drugs evil and not the life-saving people that they are.
Big pharma business. But just as disturbing was the realization that if the term woman isn't rooted in reality, then what does feminism even mean? What have we been fighting for all these years if womanhood is simply an identification that anyone can just decide to take on or off? I also struggle with the assertion that was increasingly being made that women like me and my friends who held similar beliefs were bigots or Terfs, a term which was just coming into common usage a couple of years ago, which is, of course, a slur that has taken the place of bitch and witch. Terf is a word that has the effect of immediately dehumanizing a woman and signaling to others the importance of underlying just how loathsome she is.
Okay. The good old turf is a slur argument. This is convenient. Well, let me make it clear. Turf is not a slur. Saying trans, exclusionary, radical feminist is a mouthful. Sometimes I can't even say that. So this word, number one, not even many people use that. So it's just really circulated within the people like me or like trans people who really, really care about perspective of people like this person. So saying turf is a lot shorter and more effective than saying trans, exclusionary, radical, feminist. Okay? Now, while it's not a slur akin to like, what she say, bitch or witch or whatever, it is also not meant to be complimentary. Because what is there to compliment someone who just conveniently ignores and demeans other people for their own sake? Yeah, so turf she is.
Then Bill C-16 was put on the table here in Canada. This bill would enshrine gender identity into Canadian law, establishing self-described gender as a protected element of identity under the Canadian Human Rights Act, adding gender to the criminal code, targeting hate speech, and the sentencing of hate crimes as well. Now, were anyone to think about this, one would realize that discrimination on the basis of homosexuality is already included in Canadian law. And sex is also a protected category under Canadian law. And that including both sex and gender in the criminal code is quite obviously contradictory, considering that gender simply means whatever a person would like it to mean. Gender is a...
Okay. Gender and sex being included in the same category is absolutely not contradictory. I mean, this is exactly the kind of zero-sum mentality that age-old forms of bigotry have, right? Oh, if the gays have all this right, then what about us, straight people and people who want to marry? If the blacks have this right, and what would that mean to the faith of the white race? And now, what would that mean for, all the sex essentialist people like herself when gender is also included? It's just a bunch of BS. Sex and gender can and should be included both and considered both as protected category of speech, and both are equally important. I don't know why this person does not get it.
circular, tautological notion, ungrounded in any material basis, unlike biological sex.
Okay, so gender does not simply mean whatever a person wants it to mean, okay? For all intents and purposes, no one should have to take a person who considers themselves a sharp seriously, because A, such a person is rare or non-existent, and B, if they did, they would harm no one, okay? So in this particular case, for the practicality of Bill C-16 as well as similar bills in other countries, gender basically refers to the rights of trans people to exist as themselves.
Gender is not a concept upon which laws and policies can effectively be made because, like religion, gender is a totally subjective concept.
Then how would you explain places where religions, people can actually be protected from practicing their religion, their religious freedom? Just like gender, of course, it's fuzzier than sex, which is just XX and XY. But just because it's a little bit more complicated doesn't mean that it shouldn't be protected. Just like religion, by the way.
So materiality to it. Furthermore, individuals who identify as trans already enjoyed, prior to Bill C-16, exactly the same human rights protections that everyone else did.
No, they did not. Prior to Bill C-16, and even, I believe, after the introduction of such similar bills, trans people's rights are still very limited, especially when it comes to protected, exclusive, female-only space. They still have to show their birth certificate. They still have to prove, to try so much harder to just simply exist. So no. Trans people do not enjoy the same rights as other people. I mean, you might as well just say trans people do not exist.
Prior to the bill. And while I passionately support the right of any individual to adorn themselves however they like, and to wear whatever they want, and to move through the world free from harm or discrimination, it was really dismaying, incredibly dismaying, to see the Canadian government enacting a policy that directly contradicts women's rights on the basis of sex, for which our feminist foremothers had fought so very hard.
Now, this is just fear-mongering, okay? If you, like you said, support any person's right to move freely in the world, free from harm and discrimination, then why wouldn't you support the right for trans people to be recognized and not discriminated based on the fact that they are trans? It has nothing to contradict what the feminist foremothers, as she said, have fought for so hard. The umbrella of feminism that protect women from abuse and from violence and from not being able to vote, for example, apply to all women, including trans women. There's no contradiction there whatsoever. When the time comes for us to deal with actual differences, for example, when at times for me to deal with something like racism, but also sexism, we deal with it. And also for example, when a trans person, let's say, seeks medical treatment for something that's just purely biological, then sure, of course, we deal with it. But that does not mean that they do not deserve to be protected under the feminism that protects all women.
It's a reversal of so much of what women have fought for. Because what this bill effectively does is to destroy the legal right of women to define our experiences as a class, or to organize and establish spaces away from biological men, to whom we are uniquely and biologically vulnerable.
Why would they be dangerous to you if they are biologically male, and if now they are actually women, vulnerable from the aesthetic to what they actually feel inside, just the same way you are from attack of a man. They should, like, what, you would want a trans man who is biologically a woman to be in the same space as a woman just because they are biologically a man, a woman? That makes no sense to me. Like, you're not gonna, like, in a pragmatic sense, you're not gonna be able to just set up a policeman in every single bathroom and be like, all right, let's check if you actually have a penis, or let's check if you actually have a vagina. No. All you would have to do is just your own judgment, and obviously your discrimination and pre-prejudice a lot of the times, to determine whether or not the person is a man or a woman, so that they can enter biologically, like, female only spaces. It makes no sense to me.
Whether or not they're wearing dresses. Furthermore, these laws totally negate the well-documented reality that men who identify as women perpetrate violence towards female people at the same statistical rates as do males who identify as men. And there are actually some studies that show that men who identify as women perpetrate crimes at a higher rate than men who identify.
Wait a minute. Now I really, really want this person to actually cite some source. Like, what? Does she actually believe that trans women who are biologically male perpetrate more violence towards women at a higher rate than men, than biological men? If anyone has ever done any, even just very preliminary research on this, would know that this claim is just wildly untested and wrong and misleading and fear-mongering. This is 100% absolutely not true. It is true that there's very small percentage of predators who pretend themselves to be women to perpetrate violence towards women. They are not trans women. They are not the majority of people who are legit trans women. If you look at any study, peer review at all, okay, just Google, go on to Google search. I'm probably gonna drop a few links in the description, in the bio as well. Most studies from experts disregard this exact claim. In fact, trans women experience more violence than cis women from men. They are not more likely to perpetrate more violence towards women. This is just extremely misguided fear-mongering.
And there are many examples available of exactly this phenomenon. In any case, Bill C-16 was passed in 2017 to wide acclaim by leftists almost everywhere. The bill and the embracing of the concept of gender identity was and is seen as the only moral perspective, while holding a different view, holding the view that biological sex is real and immutable, holding a view like J.K. Rowling's, is equated automatically with being a transphobe and a bigot. It's now established as law in Canada that anyone can wake up in the morning and decide that they are no longer the sex that was documented on their birth certificate for the purposes of just fact, census fact, right? And they have the legal right and the power to have that changed on all of their official documentation, rendering them, for all legal purposes, the opposite sex simply by personal decree. This means that it is no longer possible to gather accurate statistics on male pattern violence against women. And what we've seen in recent years is an upswing in the number of women who are found guilty of rape. Except that the individuals who are creating this demographic shift are biologically male.
Again, Give me the source. Otherwise, I'm just gonna discard this as fear mongering. From all the research that I have done, all the peer review documentations that I have read, there's no such thing as a significant portion of trans women now rapists, or women are now considered rapists. It's just extremely misleading. Yeah, I think I'm gonna put at least 10 links to peer reviewed research under here, and you can do your own research as well.
But according to Bill C-16 and other similar bills in other countries, anytime a male who identifies as a woman commits an act of sexual violence, that crime is entered into the law books as having been perpetrated by a woman. That's wrong. It was around this time as
It's not wrong if they actually perpetrate the violence.
well, a few years ago now, that the mainstream media began publishing story after story of heroic families with young children who, on account of failing to appropriately perform the gender stereotypes associated with the sex of their birth, were being encouraged by their parents, often conservative Christian parents, fascinatingly, to transition. That is, to announce that they are the opposite sex and to invest in clothing and accessories that would supposedly reinforce this change. And in some cases, these young children, some young children as young as 6, 7 years old, in some cases these children were being put on hormones.
This is the good old save the children argument, right? This is a favorite among bigots. This is what they use during the anti-trans gay rights movement, and of course they do it again for anti-trans rights.
Blockers, pharmaceutical drugs that we're told will arrest a child's sexual development, and which we are generally not told will also have the likely effect of rendering these children permanently sterile, as well as increasing their risk of certain cancers and inevitably creating a whole host of other health issues because, surprise, surprise, it's not actually possible to chemically suspend a human being's sexual development without creating innumerable devastating side effects, because our bodies function and develop the way they do on purpose. And while the issue of gender identity is constantly framed in the mainstream media as an important and necessary challenge to heteronormativity, the more I observed how the issue affects individual families, our society, and children.
Before I move on, sorry, I forgot to react at the right time because I was thinking. Of course, chemicals are harmful for the body. Okay, there's no denying that, but there are certain life-saving chemicals that, even though you know that there would be damaging side effects that would go along with them, you still would rather you have the effect, the good sides of them, rather than not having them. This includes antidepressant drugs, and many other such chemicals. So yeah, or like if you experience insomnia like myself, I know the side effects of taking drugs like that. But in the most desperate time of my insomnia, hell yeah, I would rather not live for 10 years as long rather than not sleep for like the 30th night in a row.
Children in particular, the more I actually saw how profoundly homophobic the gender identitarian movement really is. Rather than creating more pluralism and more openness and more tolerance, the gender ideology further entrenches gender stereotypes and reinforces the very gender essentialism that it purports to dismantle.
Okay. if you think that the gender identity movement or trans rights, okay, let's just spell it out, are homophobic in fact, then how do you describe trans people who are also gay? Yeah, there are those people who exist. How did you describe those people?
For example, in literally every single news story that I have ever come across about a child who supposedly identifies as trans, and like I said, I've been following these stories very closely for the past several years, the parents of these children offer examples of the child's problematic gender nonconformity as evidence for their transness. It is the child's attraction to objects and items of clothing that are coded as being for the opposite sex that is inevitably referenced as the proof that prompts these parents to support their child in their transition. There are no stories of trans kids that do not involve this narrative. We knew Bobby was trans because all he wanted to do was dress up in princess costumes and prance around the house, and that's how we became aware that he was a girl trapped in a boy's body. He just wouldn't wear any of the boy clothes. Now,
Okay, so again, she didn't cite any source, so I can't really tell or judge any of these stories on a more detailed level. But I don't think she could either. Like, she doesn't know any of these families and she doesn't know any of these children. And describing them in this extremely simplistic and puristic terms, it's just not fair. Maybe the family has more of a backstory, but in order for it to get the media attention or for the media to be able to deliver the message to the wider public, they have to make the example as obvious and as stereotypical as possible, such as he prances around the house, not wanting to wear any boy clothes. Like, of course, it's never that simple, especially when it comes to a family's decision to help their own child. I mean, as a mother myself, I mean, when the time comes, I absolutely think I should and I would have a very just adult conversation with my child. Children are a lot smarter than adults give them credit for. And I'm sure it's not just the surface level of, oh, wearing, boys' clothes instead of girls' clothes, therefore I'm a boy. No, it has to be a much deeper, deeply rooted identity important issues than that. And a child, yes, even a young child, can express that when the time comes.
this is incoherent on so many levels. First of all, anyone who has children will know that a child's job is to play dress up, to try on different clothing, different ideas, different personas. I was constantly pretending to be different people as a child, including pretending to be a boy. But the most tragic aspect of this, apart from the terrible damage that is done to a child's physiology and to their hormonal system and to their psychology when they're given pharmaceutical puberty blockers, is that in the past, as now, gayness has often been associated with gender nonconformity. And once you delve into story after story after story of these children who are being groomed by their parents to transition, and one notes how consistent these narratives are, the sense that emerges is that these parents often seem to be responding from a place of internalized homophobia themselves, from a desire to avoid, perhaps at all costs, having a child who is gay, to the point that these parents would clearly prefer to medicate their kids as opposed to embracing their children's preferences, while asserting that it's actually completely fine to be a boy and to love pink and to love playing with dolls and to wear sequined tiaras.
this is a very common argument among Terps, is you would transition to escape your own homophobia. this does this is not true. Okay, number one, even within the LGBTQ plus IA plus community, transphobia is still present. It's just more of a prejudice than homophobia has ever been and is right now. Okay, the acceptance of same-sex expression, same-sex marriage, as present in Canada as well as the US, as recent as a couple of years ago, gay people are accepted. Gay people pretty much can be free, like, not to say that homophobia doesn't exist, it absolutely does, but to say that homophobia is so bad that people would rather experience transphobia than experience homophobia, that is absolutely not correct. Trans people still have a long way to go to be accepted, exactly because of people like her. And also, like I say many times over in this video, the argument that trans people would transition to escape homophobia could not explain many trans people who are gay.
No, it's not always conservative parents who are embroiled in the gender identity stuff. It's also really radical leftist parents who are kind of on a different level. But anyway, it's still a similar phenomenon.
That's because your argument becomes weak if you bring in radical leftists who allow their child to transition and also be gay, okay?
Right? And this whole issue became very personal for me because my own son, Horace, Lisa, my first child, developed some preferences of his own that fell.
All right, I think this is the end of her video because she's gonna advertise her next video about her son and what have you. So I'm gonna stop my commenting right now and be right back.